Hello, bonjour and ahoy. I'm Roger Hilton, media presenter at GLOBSEC, and welcome back to GLOBcast. We are filming this special episode live from Prague at Radio Free Europe. With the 18th edition of the GLOBSEC Bratislava Forum set for the end of May, this year's edition is set to be a transformational summit for Central and Eastern Europe and beyond, with multiple heads of government and ministers set to join to address today's most pressing challenges. With so much at stake in the region, GLOBSEC is proud to have Radio Free Europe as one of our primary media partners. To help set the stage for the Bratislava Forum, I'm joined today by Jeremy Bransten, Acting Editor-in-Chief at Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty. Jeremy has been with RFE since 1995 and has a very impressive background. He began as a news writer and reporter focused on Russia and subsequently becoming a senior editor in RFERL's central newsroom and later its director for 5 years. Jeremy holds a BA in Russian Studies from Harvard University and an MA in Central and Eastern European Studies from the University of London. To boot, he is fluent in Russian and Czech. Jeremy, ahoy, thank you so much for joining GLOBcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Jeremy, let's get started. For some of our viewers who might not be familiar, can you tell us a little bit about Radio Free Europe's history and the current operations?
Sure. So we are actually celebrating, for many of our language services, our 70th anniversary this year. It started during the Cold War in the 1950s from Germany, broadcasting shortwave radio to the captive countries of the communist world. In 1995, actually, when I joined the organization, former President Václav Havel invited Radio Free Europe to resettle in Prague, and that is what happened. In the intervening period, actually, we have completely changed. We've stayed true to our values, but changed in terms of our delivery as an organization. Radio still exists in the name, but in most of our markets, we are digital first, and that means our delivery is through social media, it's through the web, it's through audio on demand. So not so much radio, but we still remain an institution. And sadly, as we've seen the retreat of democracy across much of the post-communist world, we remain very relevant and continue to provide the service we've always provided to our audiences, which is accurate news and context, and something that they cannot get from their local media, which is repressed. And unfortunately, when I first came here in 1995, I thought the job might be of short duration, and it's been almost 3 decades, and here we are, still doing the job.
Well, thank you for that intro. And Jeremy, as you said, in 70 years, it's not just the technology that's changed, but also the media landscape. So let's provide a much larger picture for our viewers. How do you assess the current media landscape in Europe?
Well, I think that Europe has been sort of submerged in all of the media trends that we've seen sweep across the world in recent years. That includes an upending of the revenue model for traditional media. It includes the rise, of course, of social media, and the fact that in many countries, a large portion of the population now get their news from social media. And so this has been a big readjustment, and it's also fueled growing distrust in government, in media, in state institutions. And so Europe has been part and parcel of that, the polarization that we've seen as well. So I would say it's a mixed picture in Europe, as it is in the rest of the Western world. Some countries have fared better, and others have fared worse in terms of the key indices of polarization and disinformation.
Well, Jeremy, you've outlined a great sort of opening pitch about how the landscape has changed, the revenue models affecting a lot of organizations. But one question that I want to return to very quickly is you also mentioned sort of social media and how people are getting their information at the moment. Going back to history, a lot has changed in the 70 years. But do you think the access to information is too much, or the availability is a problem for today's media consumers and sort of their critical thinking?
Well, I mean, as someone who works at Radio Free Europe, as an American, I'm a proponent of free speech, and I would never be a proponent of regulating media. But there is a serious issue in that the barriers to entry have been removed, and there's been a kind of equalization, meaning that one individual who wants to spread a salacious rumor or a false story can get as much traction in the most extreme cases as an established media house. A report that's been worked on by dozens of journalists, that has been vetted, that has gone through scores of editors.
Legal,
exactly,
the whole process
all
to get
of
it
that,
through.
right? It can get less traction, in fact, than some blatant lie that's put out by a small group of people, because the algorithms will find that more seductive, and therefore it'll reach more people's feeds. So this is what we're faced with, and to me that is the great issue. We've got it's been so much discussion in recent years. I'm not a proponent, as I say, of any kind of restrictions, but discussions perhaps about labeling. We have labeling for products, for safety, for food, right? So what's in there, or where it's coming from. I think these are ideas that are worth debating, because if it's just an open free-for-all and everything is equal in your social media feed, that presents a great problem, and we've seen the consequences of that.
It's obviously a work in progress a little bit, going back to sort of the labeling, as we've seen sort of recently with Elon Musk and Twitter, and how sort of some organizations have been labeled as state-sponsored and the backlash it's caused. So is there a way to sort of work around that right now, as you said, while still maintaining free speech?
Well, I think that, my bet is that brands, established journalism brands, will probably gain, actually. I think that in this flood of information, of disinformation, the only way at present to kind of get your bearings, if you're interested in getting the facts, if you're interested in serious news, is to look at who's standing behind that. So if you go to a certain media, be it the New York Times, The Guardian, I would hope RFERL, then that's a reputable name that is going to give you objective facts and the context that is accurate. And so I think in the current context, my forecast, and especially with the rise of AI and all sorts of deep fakes and other things of this nature, I would expect actually that it's the brand names that are going to gain in value, because how else will you be able to know whether that video you're watching is not a creation, whether it's actually for real?
Well, Jeremy, you mentioned the A-word algorithm, and there's a bunch of other buzzwords we can go back to, like clickbait. And those are important words where we're going to go right now with the next question. Staying in Europe, as you know, the threat of disinformation on the continent is not new, where both the EU and NATO and member states and allies have been sort of coping with its effects. Based on your work, can you elaborate on the emerging patterns of disinformation, specifically in Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, countries that you cover?
Right. So actually, in the time I've been here at RFERL, it's come full circle. We withdrew from most of our European markets. Those countries subsequently, they joined the EU, they joined NATO, and everyone thought that everything would be all right. And then we saw this huge backsliding in media freedom in certain countries, namely Hungary as kind of the leader of those, but in others as well. And so the decision was made that we should return to three of those countries, as you just named, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And there's a deep irony and sad paradox in that. In terms of patterns, yes, I think one can say that Prime Minister Orban of Hungary, in a sense, has written the textbook, if you will, for what he calls illiberal democracy. It includes several key elements. One is the subjugation of public institutions, so that includes publicly funded media. It includes creating distortions in the market, so that privately run independent media are coerced or forced to sell out to business interests that are close to the government. It includes changes in the constitution to enshrine supermajorities. And so we've seen other EU countries actually try to take some of those elements and run with those. We've seen that attempts to do that in places like Slovenia, in places like Poland. When it comes to investigative journalists, for instance, and the threats that they faced. We've seen in recent years the murder of a prominent investigative journalist in Slovakia, the murder of another journalist in Malta. We've seen violence used against journalists in Bulgaria. So sadly, even within the EU, I think we have seen sort of a spillover effect, and these broader trends being carried out, and not exclusively in the post-communist world, but that is where a lot of these things are happening.
Well, I mean, I think it's fascinating how you've outlined it, and as you said, I mean, it's already been established that outside of those three countries, this playbook is being exported, and it's already not just in Europe, but in other countries, North America, Asia as well. So I think it's a work in progress, and it's important the work you're doing. If we're looking at potential solutions right now to disinformation, Jeremy, obviously one of the most talked about options is increased media literacy as a policy that could blunt its effects. But as we know, sort of scaling this up in education and getting people on board is a very long-term process. This is sort of, I'll put you in the hot seat on this one, but in your opinion, what has to be done in the short term to mitigate disinformation?
Well, it's a tough one. I think, what's interesting, and there are surveys that show this. There's a strong correlation between countries where there is a well-funded public media and the public's trust in news media. There was a poll actually last year by Reuters YouGov in 2022. And in that poll, Finland, for instance, came out ahead. 69% of people in Finland generally trust the news media. And it just so happens that Finland is a very strong and well-funded public media. In Germany, where there's also a strong and well-funded public media, I think it was 50% was the figure. You go to a country like Bulgaria, where the public media is definitely not in good shape, and the number was 35% in terms of the trust that people have generally in the news media. In the United States, it was 26%. So, and that speaks to the polarization that we see in the US. So I think one of the immediate things is, and of course there have been successful and unsuccessful attempts to dismantle the funding system for public media. So one thing I would say is to stop doing that, to resist that. There have been unsuccessful attempts in this country, in the Czech Republic, to do that, and successful attempts in other countries in the region that have meant really the loss of independent public media in Hungary and other places. So I think that plays a key factor. I mean, in fact, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, this is kind of what we do in the countries that we broadcast to, and that is to try to serve as the public media that doesn't exist in those countries, right? So I think that's one of the keys, because otherwise, when you take that away, it becomes just a free-for-all of government-controlled and oligarch-controlled private media that are just out there to spread their own message. It's got nothing to do with what the truth is, oftentimes.
Well, you've given us the 30,000 foot view of this, and it's been a very institutional response about sort of governments and the relationship with media. But on a macro, on a much lower level, I mean, is there something that citizens or your average day person or society should be doing to try to help this in tandem with the institutional solutions you outlined?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I think as a consumer, to try to be a smarter consumer, right? When you shop for food, you look at labels perhaps, and you're kind of aware of where your food comes from, to sort of try to acquire that consciousness as a media consumer, right? Not to be just like flicking through your feed without giving some thought to where it's coming from. But I mean, it's a process for people, as it was with food labeling and other safety measures, right? It's to get into that frame of mind, and for people to train themselves, for schools to talk about that in civics classes, right? But this is all kind of longer term stuff, so I'm not sure there's an immediate remedy. I mean, we try with what we do in terms of the products that we create, in terms of video explainers and things that are social media friendly and short, and we hope will appeal to younger people. But we're also hostage to the algorithm in the social media platforms where we feature, so that's an issue.
Well, thankfully, back in the day when Radio Free Europe was really fighting the intense fight against communist propaganda, there wasn't the A word, there wasn't algorithms to worry about. But that's not to say that Radio Free Europe today is still not fighting, as we've already established, disinformation. So what is old is new right now, and obviously Russia is back in the news when it comes to disinformation, way before the February 24th invasion. So for all of our viewers, can you maybe outline a little bit how you see sort of Russia's disinformation operations as well as sort of China's strategies when it comes to this theme?
Sure, it's multifaceted, and we've sort of leveraged our strength because we deal with 23 different countries, and we can sort of see the patterns. A lot of the disinformation messages actually will originate in Russia and then percolate through to the various countries where after a while it looks like it's an organic growth that's happening in that country. I'll give you an example with the Istanbul Convention. It's a periodic hot topic. This is the convention on combating violence against women, which Turkey pulled out of in 2021 after ratifying it. And this is something that was not a controversial convention years ago, and then suddenly something happened that it became. And I think you can trace a lot of the messaging which then filtered across mostly East European countries, that the convention is all about trying to destroy the traditional family, that it's trying to subvert Christian values, that it's going to create multiple genders and turn everybody into LGBT, that it's going to impose LGBT marriages. All of these kinds of messages actually have appeared in diverse places and have driven countries not to ratify the convention or to step back when they originally intended to. And I think you can find a lot of those messages originating in Russia as the defender of the true Orthodox Christian
faith. Rome, yeah.
Exactly, and resisting this decadent Western attempt to subvert family values. So that's just one small example. I think we saw it with the COVID pandemic when it came to China. And all of the strange stories about where COVID originated and China's helping hand and all that. We saw this in Serbia. We saw this in many other countries across the region. So I think the key mechanism is that a narrative is created, oftentimes in Russia. It then is spread through social media, and you've got all of these pop-up social media places and websites. You've got dozens here in this very country, in the Czech Republic, that are monitored, in this annual report by the intelligence services. Those are then often picked up by fringe politicians and cited, or even not so fringe politicians, and they enter the political bloodstream as if they were native organic stories in the vernacular language. But if you actually do the detective work, forensic detective work, you'll see that they originated somewhere else. So that's one example I can give you.
Very quickly, obviously you've outlined how Russia is doing it, and sort of you've given some great examples with China, but very quickly, do you think the strategies differ, or are there more similarities to it in terms of how they're both trying to spread disinformation and sort of sow discord across democratic nations or the West per se?
I think that there's quite a bit of alignment, and as has been said many times, also the Russian strategy is really to sow doubt, to sow chaos. It's easier than to trying to build an alternative model. With the in Soviet times, they had an alternative socialist model to offer, let's say, but this is not really about that. This is about casting doubt on and furthering conspiracy theories about existing Western institutions, and that trying to cast doubt about the EU, about NATO and its true aims, and that's really kind of enough, right? And so that's what you're seeing, I think.
I mean, it's obviously no longer a political ideological battle, right, of communism versus capitalism. And as you said, sort of sowing this doubt or hesitation and having false currency when it comes to statements is really a massive challenge to overcome. And all the great work you're doing about building resiliency among viewers is part of the process. As we know from everybody, sort of the state of journalism right now, as you've referenced already, is quite a dangerous occupation with undemocratic governments around the world clamping down on the free press. The recent public arrest of Evan Gersovich of the Wall Street Journal is just the latest example. And for all of our viewers out here, I'm just going to give you some figures from Reporters Without Borders, where as of the report that came out recently, a record total of 533 journalists are currently detained worldwide. And the number of those killed in 2022 increased from 51 to 57, while 65 journalists are being held hostage and 49 are missing. Jeremy, you referenced already how Radio Free Europe is covering 23 countries. Consequently, do you see any international trends regarding media suppression?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, again, and we can speak of Russia as one of the inspirations for this, if you will. I mean, autocrats do share notes. If we go back to 2012, when Russia first introduced its infamous foreign agent law, which has since had many iterations. I mean, it started as a way to target NGOs that were getting foreign funding, and in the latest iteration from last year, it's you don't even in order to run afoul of the law, you don't even actually have to get foreign funding. It's enough to be judged to have been sort of ideologically inspired by anti-Kremlin thought, and you can be tagged as a foreign agent and basically shut out from the public sphere. You can be banned from certain circles, from teaching, there's a new proposal, I don't know how far it will go in the Duma, to cut off all revenue streams from people that have been designated as foreign agents. So we have seen a copycat attempt to pass a similar law in Georgia a few months ago. It was halted after mass street protests. We saw
iconic protests on Rusheveli Avenue, right? The EU flag with the water plane.
Yeah. So it was great to see civil society rise up, if you will. But it was directly inspired by what was going on in Russia. We saw in March the government in Republika Srpska also seek to approve a similar foreign agent law for that part of Bosnia-Herzegovina. We saw the Speaker of the State Duma in Russia just a couple of weeks ago meet with his Kyrgyz counterpart further east in Central Asia and publicly encourage the Kyrgyz authorities to also adopt a foreign agent law. So the template is there. And it's, as I said, the various iterations of the foreign agent law in Russia have become more and more severe to the point where we ourselves were forced out of the country. We face fines of nearly $20 million that we have no intention of paying for, running afoul of these sham laws. And we also, in neighboring Belarus, we have two of our colleagues who are jailed. We have another colleague jailed in Crimea. So we have felt the consequences very close to home of this repression, and it is becoming physically dangerous for journalists to try to do their work on the ground, and also for people to consume the journalism. I mean, we're talking about places like Belarus, like Russia, where just liking something or forwarding an article to your friend can land you in jail. So that's the degree of the repression and what we're facing here. We're talking a lot about social media and the need to engage the audience. We put a lot of effort into that. It's all about engagement. But these are places where if you engage, you could end up in prison.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the examples in Russia, it's tantamount to treason. And it's really sort of been a deterrence about promoting it. Jeremy, we're wrapping up our GLOBcast here, and I've already mentioned one A word, the algorithms, but I want to come back to one last one here. Looking to the future, the fusion of AI, the A word I'm bringing up, capabilities in journalism has already arrived, where the impact of this marriage is still very much undecided. Are you optimistic about the role AI can play when it comes to strengthening reliable journalism?
Wow. Look, this very week we had the CEO of OpenAI testify before the US Congress and himself call for regulation of the industry. That doesn't happen too often. So there is a feeling that we've potentially opened Pandora's box, and I'm a bit apprehensive. I mean, of course, used the right way, and the capabilities, we're finding out every week about new capabilities. Used the right way, it could be a great tool for journalists, for research potentially, and for investigations to sift through large amounts of data, let's say. But I'm quite apprehensive, I have to say, because look at the havoc that has been wreaked on social media just in recent years with disinformation, and we're mostly talking about text. Now, when we're talking about the generative ability to create very realistic videos and photos that look completely real but are totally fake, it's hard to wrap your head around that, and how are people going to be able to cope with that and make any sense of it? So I think that it's going to be a real challenge. And again, for these autocracies, which is the neighborhood that we deal with, I think it's going to be a tool that they will want to avail themselves of. And also because the generative ability is so vast, it just means they're going to be able to pump out just reams and reams of disinformation to a level we haven't experienced yet. So I think we're in for some potentially challenging times.
Well, challenging doesn't mean impossible. And I feel it's a duty to end the interview on a positive note a little bit. But despite all of the issues that you've already outlined, do you think, though, that technology can shift from a liability to an asset when it comes to sort of overcoming this avalanche of disinformation, if you have people who are constantly working at it and the right type of people working with technology?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I mean, we operate in a technological climate where it's very hard to hide things, right? So even in the most repressive contexts, and we're talking about countries where we cannot operate openly on the ground, we can work with people that are providing, user-generated content. We can do analysis of that content using forensic techniques to double-check that it is accurate. And so we're actually able to get videos and information from the ground despite all of the restrictions. So I think that technology in that way can be an ally to civil society, and is much harder to shut us out than it was, let's say, during the Cold War. But the difficulty is that it also gives these regimes more and more tools to fight on their end. So I think that it's going to be a long struggle. But we have been there in that struggle for 70 years. It's something that we pride ourselves on in terms of our adaptability to meet the next challenge. And so we'll be there, and I'm confident we'll continue to serve our audiences.
Well, I had one more A word about saying au revoir or auf Wiedersehen, but I think adaptability is a great way to end it on a positive note. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining GLOBcast and, of course, letting us into your amazing home here to record. Finally, this has been a great conversation, and we're really looking forward to exploring the subjects with Radio Free Europe and President Jamie Fly, who will be with us at the 2023 Bratislava Forum. For all the updates from Central and Eastern Europe's largest strategic conference, make sure to follow GLOBSEC social media accounts. And at the same time, don't forget to follow Radio Free Europe for all the breaking news and updates from policymakers from around the world. So until next time, thank you for joining us, and all the best.